On the 11th of March 1922, a mine surveyor named Walter Pruitt climbed down the manway of the Corliss Talc adit above the Rock River in the town of Windham, Vermont, to check timber sets that the night crew had flagged as soft. He was 34 years old, married with 2 daughters, and had worked the Vermont talc belt for 11 years without ever filing an incident report. The adit ran nearly 400 feet into the mountain, following a vein of soapstone white talc. The Corliss Talc Company had worked since 1894. Pruitt's lamp threw its usual small circle of light against rock that should have been familiar to him in every particular. It was not. Where the vein narrowed, and where the night crew had blasted a bypass drift the week before, the charge had opened into something that was neither talc nor the grey schist that bounded it. It was a wall, smooth-faced, close-jointed, running level in both directions past the edge of his lamplight, standing inside a mountain where no wall had any business being. Pruitt did not touch it. He sent a boy back up the manway for the foreman and waited in the dark beside a thing he could not explain, and that single detail, that he waited rather than walked toward it, is the fact that survives in the only written account of that morning anyone has ever produced. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What Pruitt and the foreman, a Corliss man named Elias Hartwell, found when they widened the breach was not a wall at all, but the entrance to a room. The chamber measured, by Hartwell's own later estimate, some 18 feet across and just over 9 feet at the crown, cut clean out of the country rock, rather than built up from blocks, the way a sculptor works, stone away, rather than stacks it. The walls carried a shallow relief along their upper third, a running band of nested chevrons, cut to a uniform depth of perhaps half an inch, interrupted at 4 points by a wider panel where the chevrons gave way to a circular motif, a ring quartered by 2 crossing lines, repeated identically at each of the 4 panels. The floor had been leveled and finished smooth, sloping almost imperceptibly toward a shallow basin cut into its center, 1.5 feet across, its sides polished in a way the surrounding stone was not. There was no soot on the ceiling, no char, no trace that a torch or a lamp had ever been burned inside it before that morning. There was no tool mark of the kind a hand drill or a plug and feather leaves in quarried stone. The cuts were even where hand tools falter, and the 4 ring panels matched each other to a tolerance that Hartwell, in a statement taken down 11 days later, described only as too near alike for any man's chisel. What struck Hartwell almost as hard as the carving itself was what the chamber did not contain. A worked space of that size, cut by any method available to any known people in any known era, should have left something behind. Chips, spalls, a discarded tool, a broken lamp, even a scattering of dust, ground fine by the cutting. The floor held none of it. Whoever had finished that room had also emptied it, down to the last fragment of its own making, leaving 4 bare walls, 1 basin, and nothing else, as though the last act of construction had been a deliberate clearing rather than an abandonment. An abandoned workspace carries the debris of the work. A cleared one does not, and Hartwell, who had cleaned out enough played-out drifts in his career to know the difference by feel, wrote that the chamber floor was swept as clean as a kitchen, a phrase that sat oddly enough in his statement, that the clerk who transcribed it underlined it twice. 3 other men were in the drift that morning, and each gave a version of events that agreed with Pruitt's and Hartwell's on every material point: the smoothness of the walls, the 4 ring panels, the polished basin, the absence of soot, the absence of debris. None of them were geologists. None had reason to invent a shared story, and none profited from telling one, since 2 of the 3 were laid off within the month, and neither ever worked for Corliss again. What they had found could not be squared with the company's own reason for owning that mountain. The Windham Talc Belt had been surveyed, drilled, and mapped by state geologists twice before, in 1891 and again in 1906, and neither survey recorded any cavity, natural or otherwise, anywhere near that face. A chamber with finished walls and repeated, matched ornament does not belong inside a body of metamorphic rock that formed under pressure over an immense span of time, sealed on every side, reachable in 1922 only by blasting through solid stone that had never before been opened. Whoever cut it before the mountain closed over it, or they did not cut it at all in the sense the Corliss Company was prepared to entertain. Word reached the company office in Chester by telegram that same afternoon, and what happened over the following 9 days is where this story stops being a miner's tale and becomes something with a paper trail, thin as that trail is. The Corliss Company's own log, a bound daily record kept without a missed entry since the mine opened, shows a normal entry for the 10th of March and a normal entry, resuming as though nothing had happened, for the 15th. The 11th, 12th, 13th and 14th are blank, not torn out, not scored through. Blank in a ledger that never once in 28 years of continuous operation skipped a working day, even through a fire in 1909 and a flood in 1915. The next entry, dated the 15th, is written in a different hand than the one that filled every prior page, and it opens mid-sentence with a note about drainage on the lower level, as though the writer had simply picked up a conversation that the reader was already supposed to be following. What filled those 4 days survives only second-hand, through a letter written some years later by Hartwell's daughter, who recalled her father describing a man from the state office in Montpelier arriving on the 12th, a man he referred to only as the inspector, who spent 2 full days inside the chamber with a notebook and a camera, and who gave an order on the 13th that the drift be timbered off and the breach packed with waste rock before the shift changed that evening. The order carried a stated reason: structural instability, a phrase that appears nowhere in the state's own mine inspection files for that district, and that contradicts the physical description every witness gave of a chamber whose walls, floor and ceiling showed no fracture, no seep, and no sign of the kind of movement that would justify sealing a working adit rather than simply fencing off one drift. The rock around the chamber was sound, the rock inside it was sounder still. What was unsound, by every surviving account, was the company's appetite for explaining what its men had found. Hartwell's daughter recorded one more detail from her father's account, the kind of small thing a man remembers, precisely because it made no sense to him at the time. The inspector, on his second day underground, asked Hartwell whether any of the crew had touched the basin at the center of the floor, and asked it twice, in a tone Hartwell described as sharper than the question seemed to call for. Hartwell told him no one had. The inspector wrote something in his notebook, closed it, and gave the order to seal the drift within the hour. No photograph from that notebook, if one was ever developed, has surfaced in any state archive. The mine inspector's office in Montpelier has no personnel record, under any name, of a man assigned to the Windham district in March of 1922. The position existed, the district existed. The 4 days the man was said to have spent inside it do not exist anywhere except in a daughter's memory of her father's account, set down decades after the fact, and never independently confirmed. By the 16th of March, the drift had been packed to within 30 feet of the breach with waste rock and mine tailings, the standard material for backfilling an unstable heading, except that this heading had just been declared, by the company's own inspector, too stable to have been opened in the first place. The Corliss mine continued operating for another 6 years on the levels above and beside the sealed drift, its production records showing no interruption, no drop in output, nothing that would mark March of 1922 as anything other than an ordinary month. On paper, the mountain kept the room, the company kept the silence. And the only people who ever stood inside that chamber and lived long lives afterward carried what they had seen the way men in that country carried most things they could not use, quietly and mostly alone. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Corliss chamber is not the only finished room to surface from inside a working mine in these years, and the pattern, once you set the cases side by side, stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like a shape. In 1897, Miners cutting a graphite vein near Ticonderoga, New York, broke into a smooth gallery some 12 feet wide, its entrance later described in a county newspaper as finished as a parlor, with a band of geometric carving along one wall that a visiting schoolteacher sketched before the mine operator ordered the gallery closed to visitors within the week. The sketch survives in a local historical society's uncatalogued papers. The gallery itself does not, since the vein was mined through and the gallery collapsed with it in 1911, unrecorded by anyone with a reason to preserve it. In 1908, a slate quarry crew outside Penargil, Pennsylvania, uncovered what a foreman's report called an old worked chamber, dressed smooth, of no use to the operation. At a depth, the quarry's own geological survey said should have held nothing but unbroken slate, laid down long before any hand could have touched it. That report is 4 sentences long. It recommends the chamber be filled rather than explored, and it is signed, and the signature is the last trace of the man who wrote it in any company or county record that survives. What is consistent across Windham, Ticonderoga, and Penargil is not simply that finished chambers turned up where geology said only unbroken rock should be. It is the shape of the response once they did. In each case, the company, or the operator on site, moved with a speed that outpaced ordinary caution, sealing or filling the find within days rather than weeks, offering a stated reason that the surviving physical description does not support, and losing, in every instance, the one document that might have let a later researcher check the claim against the evidence. No state geologist survey from the period records any of the 3 chambers as a natural formation, and none of the 3 companies ever produced photographs, samples, or a follow-up report to support the explanations they gave at the time. None of this proves an order came from any single desk. What it shows is a habit, repeated across 3 states and 3 decades, of treating a finished room inside unbroken rock not as a discovery to be studied, but as a problem to be closed. The Ticonderoga Gallery and the Penargil Chamber share something else with Windham that is easy to miss on a first pass through the record. Neither site produced a body of debris to account for its own excavation, any more than the Corliss Chamber did. The county newspaper account of the Graphite Gallery notes, almost in passing, that the schoolteacher who sketched it remarked on how little loose rock lay on its floor, as if it had been made and then dusted, her word, printed in quotation marks by an editor who plainly found the phrase as strange as she did. The Penargil foreman's 4-sentence report says only that the chamber was found clean, without elaboration, a single word doing the work that a fuller report might have spent a paragraph on had anyone been permitted to write one. 3 sites, 3 decades apart, 3 separate companies with no evident connection to one another, and in each case the same absence: no tools, no spoil, no trace of the labor that the chamber's own walls prove must have taken place. Whoever finished these rooms did not merely leave them, they took the evidence of their own work with them when they went. What the Corliss Chamber leaves behind, unlike Ticonderoga, and unlike Penargil, is a witness who kept looking after everyone else stopped. A geologist named Louis Farnham, on the faculty at Middlebury College, wrote to the State Mine Inspector's Office in 1924 asking to examine the Windham find, having heard of it second-hand from a former Corliss surveyor. He was refused access, told the drift had been closed for safety, and the matter was closed with it. Farnham's correspondence with the state office runs to 6 letters over 8 months, each more pointed than the last, and then it stops. His university course catalogue for the following year shows him teaching mineralogy rather than structural geology for the first time in his career, and his later published work, a modest and respected body of it, never once returns to the Windham talc belt or mentions the chamber again. He died in 1951. His papers at Middlebury include the 6 letters, filed without comment, and nothing after them that explains the turn. The 6th letter is the one that lingers longest, because it is the only place in the entire surviving record where anyone with scientific training put a plain claim on paper before the subject closed around him. Farnham wrote that a chamber of the kind described to him cut without tool marks, ornamented with matched precision, and swept clear of its own construction debris, could not have been the work of any documented culture known to have occupied that stretch of Vermont, and that the state's refusal to permit even a single measured survey amounted, in his words, to choosing not to know. The state office's reply, if one was sent, has not survived. Farnham's own copy of his sixth letter is the last item in that folder. Nothing in his file explains why a scientist who pressed 6 times in 8 months simply stopped, nor why the halt lined up so closely with a quiet change in what he chose to teach. One piece of the chamber did not stay inside the mountain. Hartwell's daughter, in the same letter that describes the inspector's 2 days underground, mentions that her father carried out, folded inside his coat, a hand-sized fragment of stone broken loose from the edge of one ring panel during the widening of the breach, a piece he kept on a shelf in his workshop for the rest of his life, and that passed, on his death in 1949, to his grandson. That fragment, by family accounts, still exists, held privately in Vermont, never submitted to a museum or a laboratory, never tested, never photographed for publication. It is a small thing to rest an argument on, one broken piece of finished stone in a private drawer, but it is the only surviving physical fragment of a chamber that every institution with the authority to examine it chose instead to bury a second time. Everything else, the notebook, the photographs, the inspector himself, exists only in the negative space of a record built to leave no trace of its own construction, in the mountain and out of it alike. One piece of the chamber did not stay inside the mountain. Hartwell's daughter, in the same letter that describes the inspector's 2 days underground, mentions that her father carried out, folded inside his coat, a hand-sized fragment of stone broken loose from the edge of one ring panel during the widening of the breach, a piece he kept on a shelf in his workshop for the rest of his life, and that passed, on his death in 1949, to his grandson. That fragment, by family account, still exists, held privately in Vermont, never submitted to a museum or a laboratory, never tested, never photographed for publication. It is a small thing to rest an argument on, one broken piece of finished stone in a private drawer, but it is the only surviving physical fragment of a chamber that every institution with the authority to examine it chose instead to bury a second time. What the Corliss chamber demands, if the surviving accounts are taken at their word, is not a minor footnote to the history of a small Vermont mining town. It demands an explanation for finished, ornamented stonework sealed inside a mountain that had never, by 2 independent state surveys, been opened before 1922, cut with a precision that 4 eyewitnesses independently struggled to describe, swept clean of every trace of its own making, and met, within 4 days, by an order that named a reason the physical record does not support, and by a silence that a company ledger, unbroken for 28 years, was made to hold. It asks who works a chamber to that tolerance and then carries away even the dust of the cutting, and it asks why a state office would rather lose the record of an inspector than produce the notebook he was said to have filled. The mountain above Windham stands today much as it stood then, wooded, quiet, its old adit collapsed and grown over, the drift that once led to the chamber packed with 60 years of waste rock and buried timber. The Corliss Company closed its books in 1953 and sold the land for timber, and whoever owns that hillside now likely has no idea what sits behind the fill line. Somewhere behind it, the 4 ring panels are still cut into the walls exactly as Hartwell described them, in a room no one has stood inside since a state inspector closed his notebook on the 13th of March and gave an order that ended the only investigation the Corliss chamber was ever allowed to have. A fragment of it sits in a drawer in Vermont, unexamined by anyone with the instruments to read what it might still say. The rest is still in the mountain, waiting the way it has waited since long before anyone thought to write down what a mountain like that could hold. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.